What happens when a beloved television icon sits down for what should be a lighthearted morning show interview, only to have the conversation take a sharp turn into deeply personal territory? The cameras were rolling, the audience was watching live, and nobody, not even the production team, could have predicted what was about to unfold on the Today with Jenna and Friends set. This wasn't your typical celebrity appearance gone wrong. This was something far more revealing, far more raw, and it all came crashing down in a matter of minutes. Before we dive into exactly what was said and how this situation spiraled so quickly, make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below telling us what you think really happened here. Now, let's get into this story. The segment began exactly as planned. Valerie Bertinelli walked onto the set with that familiar warmth audiences have known for decades. Jenna Bush-Hager greeted her with genuine enthusiasm, and the other co-hosts followed suit. The energy in the studio felt comfortable, almost like old friends catching up over coffee. That's what made everything that followed so shocking. Jenna opened with what seemed like an innocent enough question. She smiled at Valerie and said, "So we have to talk about your new cookbook. You've been so open about your journey with food, with self-acceptance, with all of it. Tell us what inspired this particular collection of recipes." Valerie nodded, clearly prepared for this line of questioning. She began talking about how cooking had always been her therapy, her way of connecting with people she loved. She mentioned her family, her childhood, the way certain dishes could transport you back to specific moments in time. It was the kind of heartfelt response that makes for great television, the kind that resonates with viewers at home. But then one of the other co-hosts, trying to add to the conversation, chimed in with a follow-up. She said, "You know, we've all watched you be so brave about discussing your relationship with your body, with weight, with all those pressures that come with being in the public eye. Do you feel like you've finally made peace with all of that?" The shift in Valerie's expression was subtle but noticeable. Her smile tightened just slightly. She took a breath before responding. She said, "I think peace is an interesting word choice. I've learned to navigate it. I've learned what's healthy for me and what isn't. But made peace. I don't know if anyone ever fully makes peace with decades of being scrutinized." Jenna, sensing the slight tension, tried to lighten things up. She laughed and said, "Well, you look absolutely amazing. And more importantly, you seem happy. That's what matters, right?" Valerie's response came a bit quicker this time. She said, "Thank you, but I have to be honest. Comments like that, even when they're well-meaning, they still center everything around appearance. That's part of what I've been trying to move away from." There was a brief pause. The co-hosts exchanged glances. This wasn't going according to the pre-interview notes. Jenna, to her credit, didn't back away from the moment. She leaned forward slightly and said, "You're absolutely right, and I apologize if that came across the wrong way. I think what we're all curious about is how you've handled the public nature of such a personal journey." Valerie set down the coffee mug she'd been holding. Her voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. She said, "Here's the thing. I've been doing interviews for over 40 years. And for 40 years, the questions always circle back to the same topics. My weight, my relationships, my personal struggles. And I understand that's part of being in this business. I really do. But at some point, it starts to feel like that's all anyone sees." One of the other co-hosts, perhaps trying to redirect, jumped in. She said, "But you've been so candid about those struggles. You've written about them, you've spoken about them publicly. Doesn't that invite the conversation?" And that's when things really started to shift. Valerie's posture changed. She sat up straighter. She said, "There's a difference between me choosing to share my story on my own terms and being asked to perform my trauma for entertainment. Those are two very different things." The studio suddenly felt much quieter. Jenna's smile had faded into something more serious. She said, "I don't think anyone here is asking you to perform anything, Valerie. We're just having a conversation." Valerie shook her head, not dismissively, but like she was trying to find the right words. She said, "Are we though? Because from where I'm sitting, this feels like every other interview I've done in the past 5 years. You bring me on, you talk about the cookbook for 90 seconds, and then we spend the rest of the time dissecting my personal life like it's some kind of case study." Another co-host spoke up, her tone defensive now. She said, "With all due respect, you knew what this show was about when you agreed to come on. We talk to our guests about their lives. That's the format. That's what our audience connects with." Valerie let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. She said, "Yes, I knew what I was signing up for, but knowing what to expect doesn't mean I have to sit here and participate in something that doesn't feel right anymore." Jenna, clearly trying to salvage the situation, said, "Okay, let's take a step back. What would you like to talk about? What feels right to you?" Valerie looked directly at her. She said, "Honestly, I'd like to talk about the recipes. I'd like to talk about why I chose to include my grandmother's minestrone, or how I adapted my mother's chicken dish to make it my own. I'd like to talk about food as culture, as love, as memory, not as some symbol of my self-worth or lack thereof." There was another pause. Jenna nodded slowly. She said, "Those are beautiful things to discuss, and we want to hear about them. But you have to understand, when you put yourself out there the way you have, When you share the struggles, people are invested in your whole story, not just the parts you want to highlight today. Valerie's jaw tensed. She said, invested in my story, or invested in watching me struggle? Because sometimes I can't tell the difference. The other co-hosts looked uncomfortable now. One of them said, that's not fair, Valerie. We're not here to exploit you. We're here because we admire your honesty. Valerie responded quickly. She said, then admire it without asking me to relive it every single time I try to promote something I've worked hard on. The cookbook isn't about my weight loss. It isn't about my divorce. It's about food. Just food. Why isn't that enough? Jenna took a deep breath. She said, because you've made it about more than food. You've connected these recipes to your healing, to your journey. You wrote about that in the introduction. So when we ask about those connections, we're following your lead. Valerie closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked tired. She said, maybe I shouldn't have written that introduction. Maybe I should have just stuck to the recipes and kept everything else to myself. One of the co-hosts said softly, but then it would just be another cookbook. What makes yours special is you, your voice, your experience. Valerie looked at her and said, or maybe what makes it special is the food itself. And we've all just been conditioned to think that women need to bare their souls to be interesting. The temperature in the room had completely changed. This wasn't a casual morning show chat anymore. This was something real, something uncomfortable, something that was clearly building toward a breaking point. Jenna glanced off camera briefly, probably toward a producer, before turning back to Valerie. She said, I think we're all feeling a little defensive right now, and maybe we need to take a breath and remember we're on the same side here. Valerie shook her head again. She said, are we? Because right now it feels like I'm on one side trying to set a boundary, and you're on the other side telling me that boundary isn't valid because I've been open in the past. The conversation had reached a point where there was no easy way forward. Another co-host, who had been relatively quiet up until this point, decided to intervene. She said, Valerie, I think maybe there's been a misunderstanding here. Nobody is trying to invalidate how you feel, but you have to see this from our perspective too. We prepare for these interviews. We read your book. We watch your social media. We're trying to have authentic conversations based on what you've already shared with the world. Valerie turned to look at her directly. She said, and that's exactly the problem. You think because I've shared something once, it's fair game forever, that I've given permanent permission for it to be brought up whenever it's convenient for a segment. Do you know how exhausting that is? To have your most painful moments treated like public property. Jenna interjected, trying to find middle ground. She said, I hear what you're saying, I really do, and if we've overstepped, I apologize. But help us understand where the line is. Because from our perspective, we're celebrating your openness, not exploiting it. Valerie's voice rose slightly, not to a shout, but with more intensity. She said, the line is when I come on a show to talk about a cookbook and within 5 minutes we're discussing my body image issues. The line is when every interview becomes therapy instead of promotion. The line is when you assume that because I've been vulnerable before, I owe you that vulnerability every single time. One of the co-hosts shifted in her seat, clearly frustrated now. She said, but Valerie, you built your brand on that vulnerability. Your whole platform is about authenticity and being real. You can't have it both ways. You can't profit from sharing your story and then get upset when people want to engage with it. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Valerie went very still. She said slowly, profit from sharing my story. Is that what you think this is about? The co-host, perhaps realizing she'd gone too far, tried to backtrack. She said, that's not what I meant. I just meant that your openness has connected you with millions of people. That's valuable. That's meaningful. Valerie cut her off. She said, no, you meant exactly what you said. You think because I've made money from being honest about my struggles, I've somehow forfeited my right to privacy or boundaries. That's what you actually think. Jenna tried to step in again. She said, I don't think anyone here believes that. We're all just trying to navigate a complicated conversation. Can we please take a moment and reset? But Valerie wasn't interested in resetting. She said, you want to know what's complicated? What's complicated is spending decades in an industry that judges you for every pound you gain or lose. What's complicated is finally finding the courage to be honest about that pain, and then having that honesty weaponized against you, used as content, used as a hook to get viewers. Another co-host spoke up, her voice defensive. She said, we're not weaponizing anything. We're having a dialogue. That's what this show is. If you didn't want to discuss these topics, your team should have made that clear before you came on. Valerie laughed, but it was a bitter sound. She said, oh, my team did make it clear. We sent specific talking points. We asked that the focus stay on the cookbook itself, on the recipes, on the cultural significance of the food. But those requests get ignored because producers know that drama gets better ratings than a conversation about minutes. Jenna's expression had hardened now. She said, that's not fair, and you know it. We're not manufacturing drama here, Valerie. You're the one who's turned this into a confrontation. Valerie stared at her. She said, I turned this into a confrontation. by asking to be treated with respect, by asking that my boundaries be honored. That's what constitutes starting a confrontation now. One of the other co-hosts, her voice tight, said, "You came on a talk show and you don't want to talk. That's the issue here. We're trying to have a real conversation and you're acting like we're attacking you." Valerie's hands gripped the arms of her chair. She said, "Because in a lot of ways, you are, maybe not intentionally, but the impact is the same. You're pushing and pushing on topics I've clearly expressed discomfort discussing. And then when I push back, I'm the difficult one. I'm the problem." Jenna said, "Nobody called you difficult. But you have to admit, this is unusual. Most guests are happy to discuss their personal journeys. That's what makes these segments resonate with people." Valerie shook her head firmly. She said, "Most guests have been conditioned to perform on command, to give you what you want so they can promote their project and leave. But I'm tired of performing. I'm tired of packaging my pain into neat little sound bites for morning television." Another co-host said, "Then why did you agree to come on at all? If you knew this was going to be such a problem, why put yourself through it?" Valerie was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer but no less firm. She said, "Because I thought maybe this time would be different. I thought maybe I could come on a show, talk about something I'm proud of, and not have to dissect my entire emotional history. I thought maybe I'd earned that. Clearly, I was wrong." Jenna leaned forward, her tone shifting to something that sounded more pleading. She said, "Valerie, we're not your enemy here. We're women who are trying to connect with you, to understand you, to share your story with our audience in a meaningful way. Why are you making this so adversarial?" Valerie met her eyes. She said, "Because meaningful has become code for invasive. Connection has become code for confession. And I'm done pretending I don't see the difference." One of the co-hosts threw up her hands slightly. She said, "So what do you want from us? An apology? We've already said we're sorry if you feel uncomfortable. What else can we do?" Valerie's response was immediate. She said, "First of all, you apologized if I feel uncomfortable. That's not the same as acknowledging that your questions were inappropriate. That's putting the responsibility back on me, on my feelings, instead of on your actions." Jenna's patience seemed to be wearing thin. She said, "Okay, fine. I'm sorry we asked questions that made you uncomfortable. Is that better? Can we move forward now?" Valerie looked at her for a long moment. She said, "That depends. Are we going to talk about the cookbook, or are we going to continue psychoanalyzing me for your audience?" Another co-host spoke up, her voice sharp now. She said, "You know what, Valerie? I think you're being incredibly unfair. We invited you here as a guest. We've been nothing but respectful, and you've turned this entire segment into an attack on us, on what we do, on how we connect with people." Valerie's voice remained steady. She said, "If you feel attacked by me asking for basic boundaries, then maybe that says more about you than it does about me." The tension was thick enough to cut. Jenna looked directly into one of the cameras, then back at Valerie. She said, "I think we need to take a commercial break. We can regroup and figure out how to move forward." But Valerie was already reaching for her microphone. She said, "I don't think a commercial break is going to fix this. I don't think there's a version of this conversation where we're going to see eye to eye." Jenna said quickly, "Wait, let's not make any rash decisions. We can work this out. We can find a way to continue that feels good for everyone." Valerie had already unclipped her mic. She said, "It doesn't feel good for me. It hasn't felt good from the moment I sat down. And I think I've been doing this long enough to know when it's time to walk away." One of the co-hosts said, her voice rising, "So you're just going to leave? In the middle of a live segment? Do you have any idea how unprofessional that is?" Valerie stood up from her chair. She said, "What's unprofessional is being told my clearly stated boundaries don't matter because you have a format to follow. What's unprofessional is being made to feel like I'm obligated to discuss my trauma for your ratings." Jenna stood up too, her voice urgent. She said, "Valerie, please, sit back down. Let's talk about this. We can adjust. We can shift gears. We'll talk about whatever you want." Valerie looked at her, and for the first time, there was something like sadness in her expression. She said, "It shouldn't have taken me getting upset and threatening to leave for you to offer that. That should have been the starting point, not the bargaining chip." Another co-host said, her voice cold now, "You're really going to do this? You're going to walk off our set, embarrass us on live television, and make us look like the bad guys?" Valerie paused. She said, "I'm not trying to embarrass anyone. I'm trying to protect myself. And if that makes me look difficult or ungrateful or unprofessional, then so be it. I've been called worse for less important reasons." Jenna made one more attempt. She said, "Valerie, as one woman to another, I'm asking you to please sit back down. We can fix this. We can make this right." Valerie shook her head gently. She said, "I appreciate that you're trying. I really do. But some things can't be fixed with better questions or a do-over. Some things are systemic, and I can't keep participating in a system that treats my pain like content." One of the co-hosts, clearly angry now, said, "This is ridiculous. We didn't do anything wrong here. We asked normal questions that any talk show would ask. You're overreacting, and you're making a scene." Valerie turned to face her fully. She said, "I'm making a scene. I stated a boundary. I expressed discomfort. I asked repeatedly to shift the conversation. And when none of that worked, I made the decision to remove myself from a situation that wasn't serving me. If that's making a scene, then every woman who's ever stood up for herself has made a scene. Jenna, her voice strained, said, "But you're doing it on live television. You're doing it in front of millions of people. That's different, and you know it." Valerie said, "Maybe it needs to be on live television. Maybe people need to see what it looks like when someone says enough. When someone chooses their own well-being over being polite and accommodating." Another co-host said, her tone dripping with frustration. "So this is some kind of statement, some kind of feminist moment you're trying to create at our expense?" Valerie's response was calm but firm. She said, "It's not at your expense. It's not about you at all. It's about me finally prioritizing my own comfort and dignity. If that impacts you, that's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility to manage." Jenna said, almost desperately now, "Valerie, think about what you're doing. Think about how this is going to look. Think about the headlines. Think about the fallout." Valerie picked up her purse from beside the chair. She said, "I've spent my entire career thinking about how things look, thinking about headlines, managing fallout, and where has it gotten me? Right back here, in the same conversations, defending the same boundaries, fighting the same fights." One of the co-hosts said, her voice bitter, "Well, congratulations. You're about to create a whole new set of headlines. I hope it's worth it." Valerie looked at her and said, "Even if it costs me every opportunity I have left, it's worth it, because I'll know I finally chose myself." Jenna tried one more approach, her voice softer now. She said, "I get it. I understand you're frustrated, but walking away isn't going to change anything. It's just going to create more drama, more speculation, more of exactly what you say you don't want." Valerie said, "Or maybe it'll start a conversation that actually needs to happen, about how we treat women in media, about the difference between authenticity and exploitation, about who gets to decide when enough is enough." Another co-host said, shaking her head, "You're really going to make us the villains in this story, aren't you? You're going to walk out of here and everyone's going to think we did something terrible to you." Valerie's expression softened slightly. She said, "I don't think you're villains. I think you're doing what you've been taught to do, what gets ratings, what the format demands. But that doesn't mean I have to participate. That doesn't mean I have to sacrifice my peace of mind for your segment." Jenna said, her voice tight, "We have 7 minutes left in this segment. 7 minutes. Can you please just sit back down and we'll talk about the recipes? Just the recipes, nothing personal. We'll stick exactly to what you want." Valerie was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she said, "The fact that it took all of this to get to that offer tells me everything I need to know. It shouldn't be this hard. Respecting someone's boundaries shouldn't require a standoff." One of the co-hosts said coldly, "Fine, leave then, do whatever you need to do. But don't expect us to pretend this was anything other than what it was. A guest who couldn't handle a normal interview." Valerie looked at her steadily. She said, "If this is what you consider normal, then maybe normal needs to change." Jenna was visibly trying to maintain her composure. She said, "Valerie, please, I'm begging you, don't do this. Don't walk out. We can salvage this. We can turn it around." Valerie said gently, "I'm not trying to hurt you, Jenna, I'm really not. But I can't keep hurting myself to make others comfortable. I just can't do it anymore." Another co-host spoke up, her voice shaking with either anger or emotion. She said, "You're being selfish. You're thinking only about yourself and not about the team, the crew, the people who work to make this happen." Valerie responded, still calm, "Yes, I'm being selfish. I'm prioritizing my mental health and my boundaries, and I'm not going to apologize for that. The fact that you're framing self-preservation as selfishness is part of the problem." Jenna said, almost pleading now, "What do you want us to say? What would make you stay?" Valerie shook her head. She said, "Nothing. There's nothing you can say at this point. This isn't about the right words. It's about a fundamental disconnect in how we see this situation. You see a guest who's being difficult. I see a pattern that keeps repeating no matter how many times I try to break it." One of the co-hosts said, her voice hard, "Well, good luck with your cookbook. I'm sure this little stunt will get you plenty of attention." Valerie looked at her and said, "If you think I did this for attention, then you really haven't heard a word I've said. I did this because I had to. Because staying would have meant betraying myself, and I'm done doing that." Jenna made one final attempt, reaching out as if to physically stop her. She said, "Valerie, we've known each other for years. Don't let this ruin that. Don't let one bad interview destroy our relationship." Valerie paused, her expression sad. She said, "Jenna, if our relationship can't survive me setting a boundary, then maybe it wasn't as strong as we thought it was. I hope that's not true. I really do, but I can't stay just to preserve something that might not have been real to begin with." Another co-host stood up abruptly. She said, "You know what? Go. Just go. We don't need this. We don't need you. We'll fill the time. We always do." Valerie took a breath. She said, "I know you will, and I'm genuinely sorry for the inconvenience, but I'm not sorry for leaving." Jenna's voice cracked slightly as she said, "This is going to be everywhere. You know that, right? Every news outlet, every gossip site, everyone is going to be talking about this. Valerie said, I know. And I'm prepared for that. What I'm not prepared to do anymore is sit in spaces where I feel diminished, even if those spaces seem friendly on the surface. Jenna looked into the camera, then back at Valerie. She said, so this is really it. You're really walking out. Valerie nodded. She said, this is really it. I wish it had gone differently. I wish we could have found common ground. But we didn't, and I have to accept that and move forward. With that, she turned toward the exit. Jenna called out one more time, her voice desperate. She said, Valerie, wait, please. But Valerie didn't turn around. She kept walking, her steps steady and deliberate. The cameras captured every moment. The co-host stood frozen, watching her go. The studio audience, which had been silent through most of this exchange, remained completely still. Jenna finally turned to the camera. Her face was flushed, her expression a mixture of shock and something else. Maybe embarrassment, maybe anger, she said, her voice unsteady. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll have more of Today with Jenna and Friends. But Valerie was already gone, through the studio doors, leaving behind a moment that nobody watching would soon forget. The conversation had started as a simple cookbook promotion and ended with a confrontation that exposed deeper truths about boundaries, respect, and what happens when those two things collide on live television. The cameras cut away, but the impact of what had just transpired was only beginning. In those final moments, Valerie Bertinelli had made a choice that many would debate, that some would celebrate, and that others would criticize. But it was her choice, made on her terms, and in the end, that seemed to be what mattered most to her. So what do you think? Was Valerie right to walk off the set, or should she have stayed and worked through the tension? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. We want to hear what you think really happened here, and whose side you're on in this situation.